Okay, right, thanks. Yeah, so Johan kindly shared his slides beforehand, and so we got to think about a response. It was interesting because I realised, like, I'd interpreted some of his slides differently to how we then talked about them. So I'm interested to see a reaction to some of the things I've got to say. So next slide, please, Jade. Thanks. Yeah, so this is actually this picture at the top. It's a different colour, but it's actually from Johan's slide. So what I was trying to do, I was trying to, I guess maybe mistakenly, but I just thought, all right, okay, I'm going to try and leap in and go, okay, could I try and put some equations on things? Could I try and make things anything quantitative? And so it might be that every single thing I'm going to talk about can be just thrown out immediately, but I feel like that would be knowledge in itself. It's not the right way to go. So that's why. So I thought I'd start off with this. So this was this picture that Johan had. So it was thinking about the large herbivores. This was in African savanna, and the idea was we can think about. I'm going to represent it as like a 3x3 grid or matrix here of just the abundances of our different functional types, our different herbivores in that system. So we could then represent it in this grid. We could put numbers in that grid, and then we could, in principle, track that over time. And we could, in principle, think about that as our ecosystem state changing over time when we're thinking about these changing these functional types. And so then I was thinking about the question that Johan had was, well, one of the things he'd like to know is, well, how does the probability of it being in this state versus this state change? And could we get a handle on that? And so okay, I thought, well, okay, could we? I mean, this seems like quite a scary question because I'm only thinking about quite broad categories here, and suddenly I've got to predict how that's going to change if I've changed as the environment's changing, for example. I'm just letting the system run. The environment is happening, and it's going to change state. And so, in the paper where Johan talks about this, so that's the link to it there. He also mentions this data, I think from the 70s, but basically it talks about a pattern in rainfall and biomass. And so these kind of patterns do exist in the literature on quite a lot of systems. There's quite a lot on ideas like metabolic theory of ecology, where people try and predict how systems are going to behave based on, for example, you can say, well, relationships between mass and metabolic rate, these kinds of things. And so I was thinking, well, can that idea be used here? So I thought, well, let's take this graph from Johan's paper. Well, that says, given the rainfall, so given some environment that's changing us from here to here, we can then predict how the large herbivore mass is going to change. But then the question is, well, how do I know? I know overall how the mass in all those grid squares are going to change. So there's a total biomass, but I don't know how much of that's going to be attributed to each functional type. But then I thought, well, then as Johan was talking, he said, well, actually, people do know stuff about that, so maybe we could predict that. But is it as simple as that? Are there other constraints? So next slide. Thanks, Jade. Brilliant, thanks. So that's what I'm trying to represent here. So I was trying to think, well, like how complex are these relationships? Can we take this kind of broad level view, and will that get us anywhere? So what I wanted to represent here was actually lower down the food chain. And so maybe this is representing the plants, maybe it's insects, maybe it's nutrients, I don't know, but we could equally grid those up into functional types and try and do the same thing. But what might happen here is that the effects of the environment on here might be different to here, and there's some interaction in here. So I was thinking, could we, is it possible to think in this way about these systems? Would this be a way to model these kind of ecosystems? But also, how much of these relationships can we actually get from existing data? How much do we know about how the functional interaction between different layers in our food webs there is? So that was one thing I was thinking. I don't know how far we could get with this kind of thinking, but I wanted to put that out there as somewhere that I was thinking about in terms of transitions. Okay, next slide, please. And so the other thing that I was thinking about when I was looking at the slides, I pinched this paper, actually, James, I have to acknowledge you because this is actually from a paper that James Bullock's written, but I really like the picture, and I thought it got me thinking about this. So this is, up the top here is a different, it's a way of representing perhaps a way of rewilding. And so, so the idea is that these three axes are representing perhaps aspects of what you might want to achieve when you're rewilding, in that we want to get some level of trophic complexity back in our system. We need to be able to deal with stochastic disturbances. So what we mean by that is just be able to let the system run. You know, that system's then going to be exposed to all these environmental changes naturally, and we just need to embrace that. So it needs to be able to cope with a certain amount of this. And also we need to be able to cope with dispersal, because we need our gene flow. We need to kind of, we don't want too much competition in the system so that species don't die out. So, I mean,
would a wildfire be an example?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Just even any extreme weather event, or even just normal, just environmental change. I think any of that could fit in here. And so what one of the things that James talks about in this paper, and like James is, I think, going to talk to us more in future meetings. So I would say, so he'll talk about this more. But I just wanted to pull it out because it got me thinking. Was he talks about thinking about, well, these elements are going to be constrained to some extent, not only by what we do, but by the humans in the environment. And there's a human aspect to this that we haven't talked about very much. So I wanted to put that up there, and I was thinking, well, can we think about a rewilding as, how do we even measure these? How do we even measure how well we're doing on these axes? And how do we incorporate the human element into it, if indeed we want to? So next slide, please. So I was thinking a bit about that. So in terms of the human aspect, there is some modelling out there on connecting ecological modelling and humans, and so this is an example of this. So people often call these human environment systems, and so here's a little flow diagram of how it works. So you've got sort of our environmental system that includes all our ecological processes, and that has some effect on the human system, and that can be in a variety of ways. So this is often used in a sort of conservation context. So people can care about the economic benefits of the change of environment. There might be like risks, there might be human-wildlife conflicts, potential disease threats that people aren't happy about, or there could be economic benefits or risks that people aren't happy with. But equally, the human perception of the system in a conservation context usually has some effect on the environmental system, because if people aren't going to, for example, follow some rules, if you're trying to conserve a system, then that can have an impact. So I was trying to think about this, and I was wondering if any of these kind of tools could be applied in the rewilding context, and if we did, like how, what aspect. And so I think this aspect is true, that the environment affects the human system, and there's definitely there seems to be, well, my understanding of what I've read is that there's this certainly people's perception of rewilding is an important part of, if we're going to convince people to rewild the system, then that's part of that. What I'm not so sure about is this link and how important this bit is. So the human back to the environment on rewilding systems. So that's sort of one thing I'd like to sort of put out there. Is that in this system, or is that just not there because we're trying to let these systems just run? So that's one thing. But also in the context of the picture I just had with James's picture from his thinking, here in that paper they were arguing that the human element constrained where you could be on those three axes of trophic complexity, dispersal, and coping with and the stochastic disturbance. So then I thought, well, maybe there is a feedback here in the form of those constraints. but should we be modelling it differently? So I was wondering how much of the theory that's here we could use for these rewilding systems, and how much is the same and how much is different. I was being brave, Michael shocked I put an equation in. I thought I was going to go for it. So this is an example of an equation from these systems. I just wanted to put it down because I wanted to kind of just say that there's some theory out there. So the bit of theory that's used to include the human part is using evolutionary game theory. And so basically people write down equations that track how people's behaviour changes, and so and these things can be modelled. You can get data for them, surprisingly, and there's an environmental element that goes into them. But also this parameter here, this social learning rate. I just want to talk about that quickly, but that's to do with the rate that people's actions change versus the rate that the ecological system changes. And so that's something else I wanted to bring up to discussion, is about timescales as well. Like it seems like there's probably lots of timescales going in these systems, and we haven't really mentioned that. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so in prep for that, so I'm going to get back to the timescale thing. I also wanted to talk a little bit about resilience. This kind of connects a bit to what Sergey said earlier about stability as well. So here is these pictures at the top here. So these are examples of a predator-prey cycles, and what the coloured lines are is we've taken that system and we've just knocked it a bit, so we've disturbed it. And what you can see with the red and blue here is that they're coming back to that trajectory. So often when we're thinking about conservation or resilience, you know, with that idea of getting back to the state that you started with. And so there's mathematical concepts for this. There's ways of measuring it. It's in the literature. It's still evolving even. People are still developing better ways of thinking about this. But then I was thinking, well, what's the equivalent problem for rewilding? And so this is kind of my attempt at representing that. So we've got our ecological states. So this might be before we started our rewilding, and we've done something to the system to get it going. We maybe introduced some animals, or we've taken away some disturbance. You know, we've removed our flood defences, and we're just letting the system run. And then our system ends up on a completely different trajectory from before we started that initial intervention. And so in this kind of context, we would still want to say these systems that this is resilient, this is a good system if this state up here is functionally as good or better than the one we've just left. And so that got me thinking about, you know, can we think about different ways of measuring resilience to what we had before? And so I guess in doing that, we're going to have to think about how on earth we measure function to begin with. But I thought I'd put that out there as something that maybe we could think about. Next slide, please. And then I just thought this is me sort of pulling together various thoughts I had. I also wanted to kind of mention this distinction between the passive and trophic rewilding, which sort of come up a little bit already. So the trophic rewilding is when the large herbivores are introduced. So that's generally what's thought of in that context. Although please, if I'm wrong, that was my understanding of it. But then this idea of passive rewilding, which I think there's also examples of. I think Leipzig is an example that I've read about, where like we're removing existing management practices and letting the system go. So I think in that system, they let the river take its natural course. So they remove some flood water defences and then let the system passively evolve and just let the environment do what it wanted to do. And so I guess one question I had there is, does that mean we need different approaches to thinking about those two problems, because they're quite different in some sense, or maybe they're not, maybe they're the same? So that's another question I had up. In terms of the ecological modelling, I think Sergey mentioned this a bit already as well. So like, I guess in my world, I think we often think about modeling species, and it seems like functional groups is what we want to be thinking about in this context. So I do know there's a bit of stuff about thinking about functional groups in the plant world. I know there's, but I don't know how much people think about modeling interaction between functional groups and how we would do that, and and also how would you measure the strength of interaction between functional groups. And maybe this SEM approach, this structural equation approach that come up, might be a way of thinking about that interaction. And then I guess in terms of ecological modelling, and usually we often think about managing disturbance, but this is about embracing it. And I was trying to think, well, how I'm not sure how that changes the questions we're asking of our models, but I thought I'd put that out there to get people thinking. And then I also wanted to think about the last one is like trophic complexity, and like how do we quantify this? How do we track changes in it? And I wanted to also mention this. There's actually like a very recent paper that came out that was talking about the fact that most of our biomass is actually made up of very few species in ecological systems, and there's a lot of rare stuff. Obviously, their function matters, but I could see from a kind of monitoring point of view, we might care about the function of a lot of rare things, and so like that to me just seems to raise sort of monitoring statistical questions about how do we deal with this rare stuff. The other thing I wanted to mention was that when I was looking at how do we come up with like indicators of rewilding success? I was trying to think about that. So like I've done a little bit on biodiversity measures. So I was thinking, oh, okay, well, how would you quantify how rewilding is going? And I have found one paper that sort of tried to do this, and they kind of put numbers to some extent on James's axis on that picture I had before, with the complexity, the disturbance, and the dispersal. And then they put all that into a statistic. It was a geometric average, a geometric mean, and they used that to quantify rewilding, and they applied it to a bunch of example systems where there'd been rewilding to see if that was a good assessment of how successful rewilding was compared to what they'd seen. And it did do well, but it did get me thinking about, well, could we even do better than that? If that's the state of the art out there, can we even just take a small step forward and just do better than that? What do we want from our indicator? Can we even start writing down a list of what do we want to achieve and what would be a successful rewilded system? And then I guess from a more statistical question, if we do get those indicators, how do we come up with ways of estimating them that aren't biased and measuring them? And so I think that's me, and I'll stop there.